Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the sixth Wednesday webinar for Wellbeing. Today, we're going to talk about M&E and MHPSS for children and families. Are we making a difference? A challenging title. We have a wonderful lineup that we're going to hear from. UNICEF are here both from the global level, from the regional level in the Middle East, and also from Syria. And we have other great experts that's joining us today. So this is a double webinar. This today is on M&E, and next Wednesday it's on research. And we'd love to hear from you in the chat, where you're calling in from and whom you're working for. And we also have a Q&A box that you can put any questions that you have throughout the webinar, and we will try to respond to them both in writing during the webinar and pick up on a couple at the end of it. So we have a lot of things to go through today. So with no further ado, let me introduce the first two speakers and also the facilitators of the rest of the webinar. My name is Marie Dahl. I'm the director of the MHPSS Collaborative, and I'm also the co-chair of the Child and Family MHPSS Technical Thematic Working Group. But next up, we have Caoimhe. Caoimhe is an MHPSS and Child Protection Specialist at the UNICEF headquarters, calling in from Ireland. She supports UNICEF's regional and country offices with MHPSS programming and also manages the minimum service package help desk for MHPSS with Vania, Alves, and Inka Weisbecker from WHO. We also have Rebecca Horn with us, an independent MHPSS specialist based in Liverpool, UK, and one of her roles is to staff the M&E help desk under the IASC MHPSS Reference Group, along with Brandon Gray. So it's great to have you joining, and I'm going to hand over to Caoimhe to run us through with the agenda.
Thanks so much, Marie, and good morning, everyone. So why are we having this webinar? Why did we choose this topic? Well, there can be a perception that mental health and psychosocial well-being are a little bit hard to define and hard to measure. And so people can feel a little bit uncertain about how best to monitor the impact of our MHPSS programming. And this can be even more of a challenge when it comes to programming for children. And if your monitoring and evaluation team are used to measuring more concrete things like the number of children vaccinated or the number of latrines built, the idea of keeping track of something more abstract like how people are feeling and how they're coping can feel a little bit intimidating. But the good news is it can be done. And we hope that this session will help to sort of demystify that process for people. And we're fortunate enough, as Marie said, to have some great speakers who are going to tell us a little bit about some tools that can help us in monitoring and evaluating MHPSS for children and families. So we're going to hear about the IASC Common M&E Framework for MHPSS in emergency settings from Rebecca. And we're also going to hear about the MHPSS Minimum Service Package Monitoring and Evaluation Indicator Bank from Vania. So after that, we'll hear about two real-world experiences from colleagues who have measured the impact of MHPSS programming for children in contexts like Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria. So to get started, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca, who's going to set the scene for us a little bit by summarising some of the issues around M&E that people have told us they want to learn a bit more about. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Caoimhe. Yes, so in planning for this webinar, we wanted to find out what are the issues that people really are struggling with or thinking about in terms of MHPSS M&E, specifically for children and families. So we asked members of the Children and Families Working Group, and we also asked you when you registered for this webinar for what the issues were that you were particularly concerned about. And these are the themes that we identified for general issues. So generally, there's the technical issues, like how to design an M&E strategy, the kind of indicators we should choose, the kind of tools that might be useful for children and young people. Those are obviously key and foundational. There was also an issue around how do we balance doing meaningful M&E where we get really good qualitative information about changes in people's lives with keeping it ethical and safe, especially for children and young people and families. but also for the people collecting the data. We don't want to burden people too much. We want to avoid that. At the same time, we do want to collect more than just the numbers that we've already heard about. So the whole do no harm, ethical issues is another kind of package of things that people are concerned about. There's another whole area which is not only applicable to this particular subject, but M&E for MHPSS in general, and that's to do with adapting the methods, the tools, the approaches that we use for particular contexts. M&E in emergencies was highlighted as a particular challenge, but also how do we validate tools for specific contexts? How do we adapt them to not only the context, but also the population? So if we've got children, for example, with developmental delays, how do we find tools that are really appropriate for that group? So this whole issue of adaptation, contextualization, the tension between standardized tools and things that are really appropriate for specific groups in a specific context is key. And that's something that will be focused on much more next week, I think, in next week's webinar on research, where there will be a focus on balancing contextualization and standardization. So I'd encourage you to register for that if you haven't already. And then just the final area to think about perhaps is using the data. So once we've got all this great data, how do we use that then to inform decision making and program adaptation? So lots of issues, lots of challenges, lots of things we're all struggling with. And having noted these, perhaps it's a good moment now to remind us of why it's so important that we do find a way forward with MHPSS M&E for children and families in particular. So I'll hand back to Caoimhe to talk us through this next point. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. And Rachel, we can pop on to the next slide, please. Great. So why is it important to monitor MHPSS for children? Well, we know MHPSS is a diverse and growing field. We have people from lots of different backgrounds working on MHPSS, from health, education, nutrition, social work, and many other sectors. And there are different views on what works and indeed on what actually counts as evidence. So some people working in MHPSS come from backgrounds where all interventions are tested in randomized controlled trials. Others come from backgrounds where practices are based more on expert consensus and lived experience. And there are different views on which forms of evidence are the most appropriate when it comes to humanitarian settings. So for various reasons, there often isn't lots of what might be seen as gold standard evidence behind some of the MHPSS programming that we actually see in practice in humanitarian settings. And as Rebecca mentioned, this is something that will be discussed more in the research webinar next week, but it plays into why monitoring is so important. There's also sometimes a misleading perception that mental health and psychosocial support is harmless, that it's just common sense and that anyone can do it. So we don't really need to worry about adverse outcomes. You know, we all have emotions, we all have experience helping friends in distress. So there can be a sense that this is kind of an intuitive thing, it's common sense. But actually, we know it's not always that simple. And to sort of reflect on this, I'd like you to take a moment to just think about whether you've ever had the experience where you've been upset about something and someone was trying to help you and doing their best to make you feel better, but they actually made you feel worse. And I obviously won't ask you to share any details, don't worry. But when I've asked this question at in-person workshops in humanitarian settings, people have shared all sorts of things that people have said to them when they were trying to help them and trying to make them feel better that actually made them much more upset or even made them really angry. And here are a few examples. Rebecca, if you can just click. Yep. So people said these things to communities who have experienced an emergency, things like calm down, or at least you're alive, don't be so sensitive, it's part of God's plan, why did you put yourself in that position? So these are just some examples of things that actually people said, someone was trying to help me, but it made me feel much worse. And on the other hand, I think we can all probably think of times where we've been trying to help people feel better, but we just keep seeming to put our foot in it and say the wrong thing. So supporting people in distress is not always as intuitive as it might seem. And in practice, people often get it wrong. So this happens in personal relationships, but unfortunately it can happen on a large scale in formal service provision as well. And one example of this is psychological debriefing or critical incident stress debriefing. Next slide. So this is a practice that is still very common, and in fact it's mandatory in many armed forces and in fire and rescue services where a staff member has experienced a critical incident. But we've had scientific research for many years showing that there's actually no evidence that this is helpful, and there's even some evidence that shows it can increase the incidence of PTSD at follow-up. So the WHO released an advisory against using this intervention back in 2003. It's a long time ago. They did a review of the evidence and updated that advisory in 2012, and yet we still see this happening. And I'm sure those of you working in humanitarian settings may well have seen other examples of potentially harmful practices, you know, even when people are doing their best to help with the best of intentions. So the potential to cause harm in this field is very high, and that is not always taken seriously enough. Next, please, Rebecca. And so I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is we need to learn from the mistakes of the past and understand that we have an ethical obligation to make sure that we investigate whether our interventions are actually helping or harming. So fortunately, there are some tools to help us with this. And one of the most important is the IASC Common Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, which Rebecca is going to tell us more about now. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Caoimhe. So yes, some of you may be familiar with this resource. It was originally produced in 2017, but in 2021, a new version was produced, which includes means of verification, which people have really struggled with, and so we hope this new version with the means of verification will be more helpful. And there's a link, thank you Dipali for putting the link to this common framework in the chat. The common framework's available in several languages, many languages, I won't say many, but not many yet, but several languages. So I hope you're able to access it in a language that's useful to you. Let's go to the next slide, please, Rachel. Thank you. So key elements of the MHPSS M&E framework. One of the challenges, of course, in talking about M&E is that every organisation uses different terms, different types of log frames, different types of words or languages for the elements of the log frame. So we're trying to use common language around that just to help with communication and sharing information around M&E within the MHPSS field. We know we need to get better at it, and at least if we can communicate more easily, that's a start. So the key elements within the common framework are the goal. So we have a goal statement, and that's the specific end result desired or expected as a result of project outcomes being achieved. So this is in the long term. What changes do we hope to see in people's lives as a result of the activities that we're implementing? And we have indicators, impact indicators, we call them, for that. And those are the signs that we've achieved this goal. The goal is influenced by the outcomes. So at a smaller level, these are the changes that occur specifically as a consequence of what we do. So when we take a certain action or we implement a certain activity, again, what changes do we hope to see in the lives of children, young people, families, caregivers as a result of what we do? So those we call outcomes, and we assess those also using these outcome indicators or signs that we can see that show us that the change we're hoping to achieve has been achieved. And then we have outputs. So outputs are just the actual result of the activity that we've done. These are usually fairly simple, fairly straightforward, and we assess them using the project activity details. Did this training happen? Yes, 20 people attended. We don't focus on outputs much in the common framework. The common framework focuses mainly on the goal and the outcomes. And just to say that you see the IASC sign or logo up there on the slide, that's important because that tells us that the Interagency Standing Committee Reference Group on MHPSS in emergencies have not only endorsed this common framework, but they've created it. That means that agencies, representatives of all really, let's not say all, but the majority of agencies working in MHPSS in emergencies are represented in the IASC reference group, and they contributed to developing this common framework. That means that we all own it, there is some consensus around what is inside this common framework. And so that gives us some confidence when we come to use it, and also when we come to advocate for the use of it with our organisations. So let's go to the next slide, which will show us the agreed upon goal. You can imagine the process of building consensus around what is the goal of MHPSS programs in emergencies. So this is what was agreed upon. The goal of our work overall, what we're all aiming towards, is reduced suffering and improved mental health and psychosocial well-being. So this is included in the common framework as the overall goal of all MHPSS in emergencies type programs. We also have, as I've mentioned, outcomes. So let's go to the next slide and we can see what they are. So we have 5 outcomes. Different programs have different types of outcomes, of course. Some programs will fit within one of these outcome areas. Some might be addressing 2 or more different outcomes. Of course, we wouldn't usually have a program addressing all 5. So this is about all organizations coming together, coordinating to make sure that all of these outcomes are addressed within an emergency. But as program implementers and planners, we can look at these outcomes and think which one really encapsulates what we're trying to do, alongside the other outcomes that will be specific to your organization. So you can see that there are 5 and they're divided into 2 groups. The first 3 we call community-focused outcomes. These are outcomes which kind of are preventative or promote good mental health and psychosocial well-being across the community as a whole. So we have the first outcome is to do with all responses, all emergency responses in whatever sector, shelter, nutrition, wash, everything. All of those should be organised in ways that do not cause harm, which are dignified, participatory, community-owned, socially and culturally acceptable. So this is about mainstreaming MHPSS approaches into every aspect of an emergency response. So we often see organisations working alongside other sectors to integrate MHPSS approaches, and they would be working towards this outcome. The second one, people are safe, protected, and human rights violations are addressed. That's an outcome which many other MHPSS organisations are working towards if they're focused on protection. And if you're familiar with the pyramid, the IASC MHPSS pyramid of MHPSS interventions, you might be thinking already, I can see this fits. It does fit. These 2 would fit at the bottom level of the pyramid, basic services and security. The third one is fitting more at the second level of the pyramid, and this is to do with programs which aim to strengthen the ability of families, communities and social structures to promote the well-being and development of their members. So anything that strengthens capacity within the communities to support their own members would fit within this outcome. And then the second row is to do with person-focused outcomes. These relate to programs which work with people with higher levels of distress. So usually individuals who we know, who have been assessed and found that these first 3 levels of activities are not sufficient to address their level of distress. So they may need a little bit more. Outcome 4 is for those programs which are about communities and families supporting people with mental health and psychosocial problems. We know that communities and families are the main groups who do, in fact, support people in distress. And so many programs do focus on strengthening that capacity. That's outcome 4. And outcome 5 would fit probably at the top of our intervention pyramid. And these are programs where people with mental health and psychosocial problems are enabled to use appropriate focused care. So these 5 outcomes, we think, cover most types of MHPSS programs in emergencies. Maybe you're already thinking about which one would work for your program. But I also mentioned earlier about indicators. So if we have an outcome, if we think we're working towards one of these outcomes, we also need to identify indicators or signs, things we can look for that will tell us, have we achieved this outcome? So let's look now at our indicators in the common framework. Let's go please to the next slide. Great. So here we see what I've already shown you. We have the goal, reduce suffering and improve mental health. So there are 6 indicators in the common framework related to this, 6 areas that I'll show you that you can focus on when you're developing indicators to see the extent to which your program is working towards this goal. We also have indicators for the outcome. So for outcome 1, if we could click, we have 9 indicators, suggested indicators. Outcome 2, we have 8 suggested indicators. Outcome 3, we have 11, and outcome 4, we only have 4 suggested indicators for outcome 4, but outcome 5, we have 8. So these indicators are there in the common framework. I'm not going to go through them. You can look at those using the link that Dipali has put into the chat box. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. The common framework, as I say, it's got 6 different areas, indicator areas for the goal. These indicator areas are aspects to do with functioning, subjective well-being, disabling distress or presence of mental health and mental, neurological and substance use disorder, ability of people with MHPSS programs to cope, social behaviour and social connectedness. These are generally the areas that programs aim to change in people's lives. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so we have means of verification in the common framework, which are organized into these 6 sections. And the means of verification are the tools we use to assess the extent to which we are achieving the change that we're aiming towards. So these tools have been reviewed against various criteria and they're recommended. They're not the only ones which are useful in particular contexts, but these are the ones which met the criteria for inclusion in the common framework. So we have them organized according to the 6 areas of well-being and mental health that attach to the goal. And we also have them organized according to age groups. So you can see there's a whole range there for age 0 to 5. We're missing recommended indicators in 2 areas of well-being, subjective well-being and coping for that very young age group. We have some tools for age 6 to 8. And let's go to the next slide. We also have recommended tools for age 12 to 17. So there are tools for most areas of well-being for most of these age groups, and they were recommended because they met these criteria here, which means they're freely available and we have confidence they are valid and reliable. Let's go to the next slide. We also have qualitative means of verification, and they're organized again by age group and type of area of well-being we want to address. So lots of great qualitative means of verification, and we do recommend that any evaluation strategy combines both quantitative and qualitative. Let's go to the next. So these means of verification are also detailed at the back of the common framework. There's one whole page on each means of verification where you can get more information about it. You can click on links to various resources around it. And you can also access the author who's given us permission to include their contact details in this common framework. Let's go to the next slide. And there's also an interactive online tool. It's hosted by MHPSS.net, and I think the link will come in the chat. And this is really great because, you know, it's constantly updated. You can click on the area of well-being you're interested in. It will take you to various tools that you can use to measure that area of well-being. You can click and access resources, the tool itself, lots of different useful information. So I do encourage you to have a look at that when you get a moment. I think I'm probably at the end of talking about the common framework. I'm sorry that was a speedy review, but I hope it's given you a sense of what's in there. We do have other information in about generally how to do good M&E, not specifically for children, but you can access information on how to select a good means of verification, how to plan your data collection, how to report on it, and so on. I do encourage you to take a look at that. But let me hand over now back to Caoimhe, I think, for the next part of this session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, for that quick tour. I think there's so much richness in that toolkit, and people will be able to dive into it a little bit more now that they have an idea of what's in there as well. So next, we're going to hear about another tool that can support M&E, which is the MHPSS Minimum Service Package Monitoring and Evaluation Indicator Bank. And Vania Alves is here to tell us more about it. So Vania is calling in from Portugal today. She's an MHPSS advisor at UNICEF headquarters, and she supports UNICEF's MHPSS programming globally. And Vania is also part of the team managing the MHPSS Minimum Service Package Help Desk. So over to you, Vania.
Thank you, Caoimhe, and hi, everyone. So next slide, please. I think my video is on. Okay, great. So another tool we'd like to highlight is the Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Minimum Service Package Indicator, M&E Indicator Bank, which is a sister product to the IASC MHPSS Minimum Service Package. So to give you some background, the IASC Common M&E Framework with means of verification came out in 2021, and the IASC MHPSS Minimum Service Package came out in 2022. And in case anyone is not familiar with a minimum service package, or MSP for short, it is an interagency package outlining a set of priority MHPSS activities to be implemented in all humanitarian responses. It includes a range of programmatic activities from community MHPSS messaging to community-led group activities to psychological interventions, to caring for people in psychiatric hospitals, and so on. So moving on to the next slide. So not long after the minimum service package came out, we began getting requests for help on how to monitor these specific activities in the minimum service package. And we started receiving questions like, well, if I'm doing this particular activity, what aspects of well-being should I be looking at? And how should I select and define indicators? So the minimum service package M&E indicator bank was developed in response to this. So aiming to respond to this need, and in a way, it kind of provides a link between the minimum service package and the common M&E framework Rebecca just introduced us to. And it draws on the common M&E framework to suggest specific indicators for each activity in the minimum service package, helping you to define which indicators might be most appropriate depending on which specific MHPSS activity or activities you are doing. There was also an ask for indicators that may be used to monitor and report on MHPSS at an interagency level. So the indicator bank provides common MHPSS indicators for use by different actors across humanitarian response for monitoring MHPSS activities and allow coordination groups to compile data for interagency reporting and planning. Now let's have a closer look at the M&E Indicator Bank. Next slide, please. So the Indicator Bank can be used to write proposals for funding of MHPSS activities that include appropriate M&E indicators. It can be used to review MHPSS plans and proposals of other agencies. It can also be used to strengthen monitoring and evaluation of MHPSS activities, and also to agree or recommend common MHPSS indicators for use by different actors across humanitarian response, to allow coordination groups to compile data for interagency reporting and planning. Next slide, please. So the indicator bank points to which MSP minimum service package activities can contribute to each of the outcomes in the IASC Common M&E framework. For example, as you can see on the slide, MSP activities 3.4 to 3.9 can contribute to outcome 3. Family, community, and social structures promote the well-being and development of all their members. And the same applies to all the other activities that are listed here on the table and that you can explore more in the M&E indicator bank. Moving on to the next slide, the Common M&E framework identified 6 domains of mental health and psychosocial well-being, also known as goal impact indicators. We can see those on the top row of the table, and that is functioning, subjective well-being, distress, mental, neurological, and substance use disorders, coping, social behavior, and social connectedness. Now, the MSP Indicator Bank suggests which domains of well-being may be most directly impacted by each MSP activities. So, for example, we expect activity 3.6 that you can see on the table, that is group activities for children, to impact subjective well-being, coping, social behavior, and also social connectedness. Whereas we expect activity 3.10 that you can also see on the last row, that is mental health and general health services, to impact functioning, subjective well-being, distress, mental, neurological, and substance use disorders, and coping. As you can see, minimum service package activities may impact several of these domains, as well as additional domains not included in this framework. Now, it is important to note that selecting which domains are most relevant to measure the impact of an activity in a given context should be informed by the specific program content or curriculum being used and measured by appropriate means of verification from the IASC Common M&E framework. Now, moving on to the next slide. The indicator bank suggests a range of indicators that may be used or adapted for different contexts when using the minimum service package. For each MHPSS activity, indicators are presented that measure both the reach of the activity and its impact. Process indicators measure the number of participants or events associated with the activity. So examples include the number of people trained, the number of people engaged in psychological interventions, or the number of people contacted through an information campaign. These indicators will tell us how many people participated, but they do not tell us whether the activity had any positive or negative impact on those people. Now, impact refers to an increase or decrease in participants' knowledge, skills, attitudes, mental health, or psychosocial well-being over the course of an activity. Examples include changes in knowledge tests, attitudes, levels of functioning, subjective well-being, severity of distress, frequency of symptoms, coping ability, social behavior, or social connectedness. Now, let's zoom in on an example. So here we have, next slide, please. Oh, there you go. Activity 3.7. This is promote caregivers' mental health and psychosocial well-being and strengthen their capacity to support children. As you can see, we have a range of process and impact indicators that may be used or adapted for different contexts. The suggested process indicators here focus on the activity implementation, on its reach. And we have, for example, the number of service providers trained to provide MHPSS orientations, capacity building, or supportive follow-up to caregivers. We also have the number of service providers supervised while providing MHPSS to caregivers, and the number of caregivers reached to orientations, etc. Regarding the impact indicators, we will be looking at an increase or decrease in participants' knowledge, skills, attitudes, mental health, or psychosocial well-being. For example, the percentage of caregivers that demonstrate or report an improvement in their mental health and psychosocial well-being associated with the support received. And you also have other examples below. Now, moving on to the next slide. As we mentioned before, the indicator bank also suggests indicators for monitoring the MHPSS response as a whole, meaning monitoring MHPSS work at the interagency level. This is something interagency MHPSS technical working groups and different clusters and areas of responsibility sometimes want to do, for example, to help monitor progress towards targets in humanitarian response plans and refugee response plans. The MSP suggests indicators for monitoring which activities are being implemented across the response as a whole, indicators on numbers, overall numbers of people reached, orientations conducted, referrals, and so on, as well as data on how the coordination mechanism is functioning itself. The diagram that you can see here is an illustration of how information might flow between the different interagency coordination mechanisms to create a collated report on MHPSS. And lastly, on the last slide for this bit on the MNE indicator bank, we can see that in the indicator bank, we also have boxes of additional suggested indicators for monitoring MHPSS within specific sectors. So that's been a quick tour, I understand, for what's the indicator bank, but it is available on the downloads page of the MSP website. The MSP team is also planning to do a longer webinar to dive a bit deeper into the different sections of the indicator bank, and then we will put that recording on the MSP website. And you are also welcome to reach out to the MSP help desk. We will leave the MN indicator bank link on the chat box. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Caoimhe.
Thank you so much, Vania. So now we're going to bring this all to life with a couple of real-world examples from humanitarian settings. So we're lucky to have Tim Conibear with us to tell us about one experience. So Tim is the founder of Waves for Change, which is a child protection and youth development organisation based in South Africa. And Waves for Change has developed a play and sport-based activity or intervention, called Take 5. And Take 5 is being piloted with UNICEF child protection partners in Somalia and South Sudan. So Tim is going to present some of the initial data from this programme for us. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Caoimhe, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on the call today. As Caoimhe says, we've been piloting an MHPSS intervention for children, vulnerable children in emergency settings. The intervention is called Take 5. If some of you have been following it, you might also see it referred to as the 5 pillars. And I'm just going to share some initial data from the project. So if we go to the next slide briefly. So yes, thank you. So just quickly what Take 5 is. What we're aiming to do is to introduce 5 protective factors to the lives of vulnerable children. So we want vulnerable children to have spaces they can go that are physically safe and emotionally safe, where they can make new peer connections, they can take part in fun activities on a regular basis, they can learn some self-regulation skills or coping skills. And we want the people that they form relationships with to identify and refer or even contain child protection issues. The way that we do this is we train facilitators. So these would be UNICEF child protection actors. We train them in a very simple, what we call teaching routine. So this routine consists of 5 steps, 5 simple things you can do with children on a daily basis. We call them energizers, check-ins, Take 5, which is kind of a paced breathing activity. And then we have lots of activities, play games that these facilitators can play with children. The facilitators receive training in this routine, and then they receive ongoing supervision where we develop specific competencies in these youth workers to work meaningfully and safely with children. We know then that if children regularly attend these Take 5 programs, they're going to have more positive experiences more often, which should influence the way they think and feel about the world around them, informing their behavior, and hopefully informing behavior change. And broadly, we refer to that as improving their well-being and resilience to adversity. So if we go to the next slide, I can just walk you through how we've been evaluating this. So we train facilitators in this Take 5 routine. And we want to understand if the training is valuable to them and if it helps them in any way. So what we do is we do a quick survey after the training, looking exactly at that. Do the people that we train in this Take 5 approach find it useful? Does it change their knowledge in any way? And would they recommend the training to other people? We often find recommendations to be quite a powerful sign of endorsement. So what you can see is in 2023, we had pretty good good satisfaction from the training. We took some of the feedback and we improved the training. And this year, we're kind of trending upwards in satisfaction from facilitators we're training in the Take 5 program. And you can see a couple of qualitative answers from the surveys that we use. It just gives you a little bit kind of more insight into why these people found this training useful. So once the facilitators are trained, they go into the field and they start using this Take 5 routine, and they've used it in interim care centres, youth centres, camps for displaced people. And if we go to the next slide, we can start looking at what this looks like in the field. So we look at the process. If a coach has been trained in Take 5 and they go into a camp for displaced children, do they create this space that is fun, that is safe, that is enjoyable, that's teaching children how to relax? And the way we do that is initially quite qualitative. We ask children to describe the space that they have come to and the activities that are being delivered in that space. And we use word cloud technology. It's very simple. You just plug the words into a software and it builds this nice words cloud. And it gives us an understanding of a child's experience of the space this facilitator is creating. So on the left-hand side, you see this beautiful image of just a safe circle. On the right-hand side, it tells us what's happening in these programs. So there's the play element, there's the energizers that come through, there's the Take 5, there's the friendly, music, happy, good. So these protective factors, you can start telling that these spaces are exactly what we want them to be. And again, there's a little most significant change question at the bottom there. So at the end of these process surveys, we ask children what's changed for them. So it brings it to life a little bit as to the value of these spaces and how that leads to social behavior change. And then the next slide. And then what's the impact of this on children's well-being and resilience? So this data comes from Somalia last year. We used, again, the word clouding technology. These are 2 interim care centres, one in Mogadishu, one in Dusamareb. Again, you can see the environment created by the facilitators that were trained and supervised was exactly what we want it to be. On the right-hand side, then we did a sample, a pre and post-test sample with about, how many children is that? 500 children. We used the WHO 5 inventory to track change in well-being. So this is a 5-question survey. It looks at subjective well-being. We did a pre-measure and then a post-measure after 3 months, and you can see fairly significant changes there. And then we looked at resilience, so your ability to get through the adversity that you're facing. We used the brief resiliency coping scale at pre and post, and again, we saw some good changes there. What I would say is when we're doing pre and post tests, you need a partner or you need a research partner with quite high capacity. We do find that pre and post tests are quite difficult when you go into more fluid settings. But the interim care centre setting in Mogadishu was run by the Elman Peace Foundation, fantastic partner, very high capacity. So we could do these pre and post tests and start looking at the longer term impact. I think there's 1 or 2 more slides after this. So if we go for the next slide, what are people? So then we just look at what people are saying about the Take 5 program. So we know it's impacting children's well-being, but where's it going beyond that? How's it influencing the world around the children? So these are just quotes. We do key informant interviews with people that are engaging with the program. In South Sudan, there's a really nice example from a prison officer. The facilitators we trained took the Take 5 program into a prison where children were being illegally interned, for want of a better word, and they opened up a 2-hour activity space during the day. And we interviewed the prison officers, who said, what happens? We knew that the children were having these positive shifts in behavior. We used the word cloud technology, and we knew that the space that these facilitators were creating was safe and fun and enjoyable. The prison officer was then able to tell us about bigger shifts in the individuals, but also in the community where Take 5 was integrated. And there's a really nice quote down to the bottom from a mother of a participant attending one of those Elman Peace interim care centres about how the specific self-regulation skills, the 3 Ts, the Take 5s that they've learned, they've been sharing with the mother. So you see the impact going beyond just the individual into the community. The last slide, I think, and then I'm done, is just the next steps. We're looking to grow the number of UNICEF country offices using Take 5. It's an open access toolkit, and we offer training. We're working with UNICEF to incorporate the EQUIP measure to look at how we change coach competencies or facilitator competencies in more depth. And we have engaged with the Wellcome Trust and University of Edinburgh to run an external outcome study in Cape Town, South Africa next year. So we're going to be working with the Department of Culture and Sport in the Western Cape of South Africa. They'll be using Take 5 in various different after-school sports settings, and we'll be looking at the longer-term outcomes and impacts on child wellbeing. So yeah, thank you very much for having me on. It's great to share the data with you, hopefully bring some of the amazing work to light. And I've also learned a lot actually from being on here. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Tim. And I think that's such a nice example that shows us how the qualitative and quantitative sides can really complement each other and sort of bring each other to life. So thank you so much for sharing that experience. So now we're going to hear another experience from Jihad Taha in Syria. And Jihad is a child protection specialist working with UNICEF based in Damascus. He's the lead on the MHPSS program for children and caregivers at UNICEF Syria. And he's also leading on the office's social and behavioural change programming on child protection and mine risk education. So quite a broad portfolio. And I'd just like to remind everybody that you can put questions in the question and answers box. We might not have loads of time for answering questions live at the end of this. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat box and the panelists can answer as we go along. So over to you, Jihad.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. So I'll try to be quick because I'm being mindful of time and also to keep the door open for some Q&As. So if we jump to this second slide or the next slide. So basically in Syria, we've developed two programs related to MHPSS, one for children and one for caregivers. And these programs were developed based on some challenges we've had in relation to MHPSS interventions. So there hasn't been a much structure to these kind of interventions in the country. So back in 2018, relevant ministries expressed some concerns about the lack of structure and the lack of what they could see as impact of these kind of interventions. So working very closely with ministries and stakeholders, we managed to develop these two programs. And after a very long process, like two programs were developed and created together with national stakeholders. The two programs, the first one called Sanadi, which is My Bedrock or My Foundation, which is the parenting program, and another program called Sawa, which is the program for MHPSS for children, which means being together. And so far, more than 100,000 children have attended the Sawa program for children, and more than 23,000 parents have attended the program on parenting. On the next slide, I'll briefly show you what the program on what the Sawa program talks about. So the Sawa program is a cycle-based program. It's divided into different age groups. Each group has to attend 16 sessions according to his and her age. And the program focuses a lot on emotional literacy, recognizing and naming feelings, social connectedness, and empathy. If you go to the other slide, which is a quick brief on the Sanadi parenting program, there are 6 sessions that are core that all parents will attend, and then parents choose to attend 6 additional sessions that are based on the age of their children. So if you're expecting or you have a newborn between 0 and 5, you would attend the 0 to 5 program, where you would get a lot of more content focusing on very age-specific topics. If we go to the next slide, in order to monitor these two programs, we set up a very comprehensive monitoring and evaluation strategy, because on one hand, we needed to comfort government and authorities in terms of why are we spending so much money on these kind of activities with children, and on the other hand, we also want to know why we're like, is there any kind of impact on what we're doing with all of these children and parents? So we've created a CAP survey. So it's a pre and post knowledge, attitude, and practice survey. 10 questions for knowledge, 10 questions for attitudes, and 10 questions for practice. And I'll show you some results in a bit. In addition to that, we've also included most significant change research. We've done it at a large scale to ensure that we manage to get feedback from both children and parents of children attending our sessions. And at the same time, we also have feedback sessions, field monitoring that's done by UNICEF staff, by partner staff, by third-party facilitators to ensure that we also get some qualitative results. And then on the piloting, I'll speak to that point in a bit as well. So if we go to the next slide. some of the results and to showcase some of the impact that we've had on children attending 16 sessions of MHPSS. So I've chosen some of the questions that we have, but at the moment we have around 30 questions for each that each child has to respond to. So some of them are, for example, I have the right to be protected, I know where to report abuse, I think I'm lonely, and you can see that there is a lot of change happening before attending the sessions and then after attending the sessions. So for example, I think I'm lonely is 46% before, and then it reaches 78% after. And this is something that we can then relate to social connectedness, for example, and having a social network. If we go to the next slide, just quickly to give a brief on the caregivers program. At the same time, for the caregivers program, we can also see that there's a lot of change happening. Again, just as a quick example, for example, do you think that slapping is a bad means of discipline? You can see that in the beginning, at the beginning, before attending the 12 sessions of the programming, parents would say, like 28% of parents would say, yes, I think it's bad. And then this increases to 65. If we move to the next slide as well, and I'm sorry to going through this very quickly, but we can always talk to this later on if you have questions. In order to back up the quantitative data that we have, we're asking questions through the most significant change methodology as well. And as you can see here, we have some different themes that are popping up. So for example, confidence and trust between the parents and the children. That's something that we can see that there's a lot of increase happening. It's the same in involvement in the year lives of their child. Some parents would express to us that they have not had this kind of interaction with the children before attending the program on parenting, for example, or once their child attend the MHPSS program, they can also see that they're being more communicative in terms of their needs and what bothers them. So we have a lot of narrative that then backs up our figures from the previous slides. If we go to the next slide. Just quickly to highlight that we have a lot of feedback mechanisms that we also use with our partners. So we keep on bringing our partners in. Syria is a very big country, so it's very important to have these physical meetings where we sit together and we develop locally led solutions. So for example, what would work in one governorate could maybe not work in another governorate. So it's very important that we sit together and we keep the spirit of the manuals, but we then sit and discuss very specific problems that they might be facing. And at the same time, we have focus group discussions with the parents, we have rapid surveys, etc., etc. So if we go to the next slide, I'll quickly just give on next steps, what we're doing in the program now. So we're working with experts, including Johns Hopkins University, to see how we can validate the tools even more. It's very important for us to remove any kind of bias that questions might have, and it's also how you how you phrase your question. And when you ask a child something or you ask a parent, you don't want us to direct them towards some kind of different answers or specific answers. At the same time, we can also see that there are some signs of when parents, especially mothers, are attending our program, we can see that there's some signs of early signs of anxiety and depression. So it's very important for us to see if, and what we can see is after attending the program, we can see that these mothers are saying that they're becoming more social, they're having like better sleep patterns at night, they're being less aggressive with their parents and with spouses. So that's something that we want to look at, and we're working on having some revised tools with a very smaller number of beneficiaries that will ask them targeted questions to see if this is really the case, if our program is able to respond to some slight signs of anxiety and depression. I think that's the last slide from our side. Yes. So thank you, and sorry for being quick, but yeah, we can always have more. If there are any questions, happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jihad. I think the data you have there is so rich, and I'm sorry it's very unfair to ask you and Tim to present such amazing, rich programs in about 7 minutes. So apologies for that, but hopefully it's piqued everybody's interest, and I think there'll be a chance to follow up a little bit more. Again, I think the visuals you presented are so striking, and I think that's a nice, that can provide ideas as well for people as to how they can look at this and how they can communicate the data as well, because monitoring and evaluating the programs is one thing, but there's not much point in doing that if we don't tell anybody about what we find. So that is also a really important part. And also, I just wanted to highlight how you flagged the the research partnership with an academic institute, and Tim also mentioned some partnerships with government institutions, and I think that also can very much expand the reach. You can bring in expertise from different types of institution that can help with monitoring and evaluation as well. So thank you so much for that. So now we have a few minutes for questions and answers, and I think Deepali is going to help us to moderate this. I don't see any in the question and answer box right now, but I know people are probably processing all of that content.
Yeah, we don't have any questions. Have any questions?
We're getting some feedback as well.
There we go. Okay, that works.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, Caoimhe, you're right. We don't have any questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. Tim has raised his hand. Maybe he has a question to ask. Please go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I have one question. We obviously run lots of programs for children in various different parts of the world, and as you grow your programs around the world, it becomes harder to monitor your outcomes using pre and post tests. So I'm just interested if anyone on the call has had any luck using single time point reflective surveys to look at changes in well-being or resilience. Because I think when you're working with big populations, it can become very expensive to try and track them using a pre and post survey. It takes a lot of manpower, a lot of human resource to do that. So I'm just interested if anyone on the course found a single time point or reflective survey specifically looking at a well-being or resilience outcome.
Who would like to take that from the panel?
It's highly possible that no one has yet, because that's what we're struggling with, is trying to find one. So I was just thought, if anyone's found it, it would save us some time and trouble.
Caoimhe, you wanted to jump in?
I can maybe quickly respond. So I think it's a good, yeah, I haven't used a scale, a sort of a retrospective scale, but I do think it's worth, you know, if you can't do a scale, if you don't have the resources to do kind of a pre and post, I think it's still worth asking people just their satisfaction with the program, you know, retroactively, or even saying, to what extent do you think this program has affected your well-being, you know, and some sort of, you know, on a scale. Even one question is better than no question. Obviously, methodologically, that is not as robust as doing a pre and post test where you're using a validated scale. But I often think, particularly for people who are new to monitoring and evaluation in MHPSS, they can be quite intimidated by the idea of having, you know, long validated scales that are 30 questions or more that you have to analyze then, because a lot of people don't have the capacity to analyze very complicated scales. So I think there are the gold standard ways of doing things, but I also think there are some good enough ways of doing things. And even a simple survey that you only do at the end that asks people, well, how do they feel about it? You know, what were their levels of satisfaction? Do they think it impacted their well-being? Is a good starting point, and at least you have some data to work with. So it's not quite what you were looking for, but just to say, I think it's worth doing something small. Doing something small is better than doing nothing at all. Over. Does anyone else have any experiences to share on that? Oh, Rebecca and Jihad, I see you both have your hands up. Rebecca, I saw you first. You're muted.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, so to support what you say about doing something that's good enough, but I think we need to recognise that if we don't have pre and post, we can't speak about changes that have occurred, because when we ask people to reflect back, we don't remember. If someone asked me, how did you feel last week? How did you feel? It's influenced by so many things that it's not really very reliable data in terms of what change has actually occurred. So without pre and post, we can't really say that, but maybe we don't have to. Maybe good enough is good enough, and asking people, what changes do you the most significant change is a fantastic thing, and it's great to see that both of you are using it in that way. So I think it's about doing what you can do, but also being transparent and realistic about what claims you can make based on that data. Jihad, yes, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so just very quickly, just to say that we're doing the test for all of the participants in our program. So we have facilitators and we have data collection staff in our partner organizations. So it is a requirement that every child attending our program and every parent attending has to do a pre and post. So the data that we have is based, is large scale data analysis. So it is the 100,000 children attending. They have all done a pre and post test. And the same for the parenting. So it's tiring. It takes a lot of time. But yeah, we can see that it is possible. We just need to push the partners a bit and find like some easier ways. To make it easy for them to be effective.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's helpful. The reason I ask is in some settings, interim care centres in Somalia, where there's a very structured space that children go to, and the intake is very structured again, predictable. You can do the pre and the post test. Where we're also working, for example, in camps along the South Sudan border, where it's a very fluid population, it's almost impossible to do pre and post tests. It just doesn't work. And what we know is that these youth centres and these social connections that children have are so valuable in improving their well-being, their resilience. So we're just trying to work out gold standards, obviously pre and post, but where you're working in a very fluid environment, we've just got to be honest and say, like, it's not really feasible to do a pre and post test with a child that's going to walk across the border and then maybe leave in a few more days. So we're looking at these single time point measures as well. Most significant change is very interesting, actually. Thanks for that. There must be ways we can adapt that. So thank you for answering that.
I'm going to come in now and wrap up since we're at the hour. It's been a very interesting presentations and conversation. I have a feeling that we could continue for quite some time if there was more time. But it's been amazing. Thank you so much for everyone who prepared and who came and joined us, both contributors and listeners. And I'm just going to give a little advert for next week's webinar, because this time it's a double one. So next Wednesday at 6 on the 6th of November at 2 p.m. Central European time, we're going to hear about what counts as evidence in MHPSS, reflecting on the key dilemmas in MHPSS research. We'll really get to hear there a dialogue between 5 researchers from different parts of the world on some of the key dilemmas involved in conducting MHPSS research with children from culturally and contextually diverse settings. And the panelists will critically reflect on the tensions between participatory methods on the one hand and evidence-based paradigms on the other, and explore how these approaches can complement each other in shaping MHPSS research. It's going to be very interesting, and it's going to look a bit different than the previous webinars and more of a dialogue, and we're looking forward to that a lot. So I put it in the chat box, the registration, and I'm putting it once more, the landing page for all previous webinars and also the links for registering for upcoming webinars. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day.